All right. Street running in Montparnasse. Okay, good. Not 100% easy. That's awesome. You seriously wouldn't know anything's different. It's just the way that it's been established. The good thing is street running Montparnasse in the store. It's gonna start soon. So, right. I'm gonna stick this in my pocket. Just like that. Stick three. Pretty good. Okay. Thank you. Now I can probably hear myself. I should be able to hear myself. I have to test this. Test this. Testing, testing. I can hear myself. I gotta be able to hear myself. Can I hear myself? Why isn't this working? Microphone check. Microphone check. I should be able to hear. Should be able to hear. Nice. Can I hear? Can I hear? No. Can't hear myself. Should be able to hear myself pretty nicely. What I'm feeling. It's a feel. It's a feel. It's a feel. Oops. We have a feel. It's a feel. Feel. It's a fail. It's a fail, but is it a fail? Is it a fail? Is it a fail? Fail. Is it a fail? 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 Got to hit. I got to be able to hear this. I got to be able to hear this. 1, 1, 2. Got to be able to hear this. Hello, everybody. Hello. I don't see you quite yet. Good morning. Hi. I'm just hoping you can hear me because I can't hear me. Ann, can you hear me? Yeah, usually I just plugged in these earphones. They should work, these headphones. This is good. This is all new equipment. Yes. Welcome. Welcome back to Paris. This is an exciting day today. We just went on lockdown. Oh my goodness. My name's Gil, if you haven't met me before. I'm from Moontown Walk and Travel. My intent today is to show you street running and Montparnasse, the neighborhood of Montparnasse. You can see the wind blowing through my hair. I have a new mic situation and it should be doing well. My only issue is that I can't hear myself. So I thought that we might have a dialogue at some point, but truth be told, a lot of times I just point the camera straight forward and you look at the chat room if you can, and I'm going to change this direction to show you the scene. So I came here about 11 years ago, and I've been here dissecting, bisecting, trisecting, trying to figure out French society. And today's a strange one because yesterday, or at midnight today, we went on lockdown. And when you go on lockdown, to me that means that we don't go outside. But I'm about to show you the city, and then we'll get right into it. Oh yeah, that's where we are. Plug this thing, it doesn't work anyway. Give you a sense of where I am. So this is the Louvre, and I'm on the Seine. People shouldn't necessarily be out, but the government said you can come out for as long as you want. You should have you should be able to exercise and be outside. You don't have to sign an attestation to say, to declare your purpose outside. It was the case in the first two lockdowns. You had to declare and you had a limited amount of time, but the government closed all non-essential shops. So what you'll see today is that bookstores are open, hairdressers are open, libraries are open. It's just clothing that's not open, and everybody's confused. And there's people all along the quays. I've never seen as many police today, or ever in the city, as I've seen today. There were so many police out, hundreds of police because of demonstrations and things. So it's a pretty exciting day. We're gonna get right into it. We're gonna get into street running. I made this up about 11 years ago when I was living in Boston. So I went to college at Brandeis and I studied nonprofit and public management at NYU. But in college, my interest was in English and American literature and politics. And I had this internship for Senator Ted Kennedy in downtown Boston. And I was taking a class on Boston architecture. And prior to having gone, because I'm from California, having gone to college in Boston, I didn't really understand the walkable city. And from the learnings in Boston architecture and from the assignments I had and things, and from doing that internship downtown, I discovered the walkable city. And I discovered some principles of walking and urban planning. And those contributed to the ideas that I'll share with you today, which I advanced in when I moved to New Orleans. So today, I'm going to show you some images. You'll forgive me if this slides over. I hope you can hear really well and you have a more crisp image because I am also using somebody else's camera. I'm going to get this camera for myself if I can. So a lot of maps will come into the picture just now, just because I want to show you where we are and give you a sense of the city, and because I like maps quite a bit. And maps are going to define some trajectory today. Today we're going to do something that you probably haven't done, definitely not with me. And that's when you take a walk like this, you typically expect a linear narrative, and I'm going to be strolling. This is the city in its entirety, 20 districts. That's the 14th district that's highlighted just there, and that's where we're headed for Montparnasse. That's where Montparnasse would be. So that's where we're headed. But I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there. I know where I am, don't know how I'm going to get there. This is the 7th district. You know, I'm going a little bit quickly. And if you want to identify some things, on the left, that's the Eiffel Tower. In the center of the image, that's the Hôtel National des Invalides. And I'm near the top of the screen, which is the Jardin du Carrousel. So the gardens of the Tuileries will be at the end of the Louvre. And this is the 6th district. So I'm currently like right at the top of your image. This is the 6th district. So we're doing these districts today. I'm going to stop this. You're looking at me. I'm going to put you back to the city so that the Tuileries are open. Okay, so without any further ado, as long as you can hear me, this is wonderful. Sometimes I carry my own maps, but you won't have a sense necessarily of that. Why I have that. Originated in Boston and New Orleans. So what is it? Is it a discipline? Is it a method? Is it a style? Is it a lifestyle? Well, I'll tell you straight away that the discipline is about walking into the life of any city and experiencing it beyond the restraints of access. So today I'll be the eyes and ears, let's say, for the city, but hopefully you'll be able to hear a little more than just what I am presenting. I don't know with this new mic, I think you can probably only hear me unless someone stands right next to me. That's a good thing. So it's about walking into the life of any city and experiencing it beyond the restraints of access. It's also an outlook on travel for those seeking a creative connection with the urban city. It's got 5 origins. Hope you're going to enjoy the scenery in the 7th. It's extraordinary. We're heading to the 6th soon. That's me, of course, not Shadow. It's extraordinary. This is the area which would be most identified with the nobility. So we're right next to the center of the city. Of course, if the Louvre is just on my left here, the Louvre originally was a palace for the kings and queens. Originally, it was a fortress and it became a palace. But today, facts and figures will play less into the first part of this trip. I want to tell you the 5 origins of street running, so you'll get a sense about how this developed. So for me, the 5 origins were, number 1, to escape or avoid the crowd. There's a crowd at the block. I step right into the street. I literally am walking in the street. So it's to get around. Lots of times I could tell you that I developed this in Chinatown in New York. Oh my goodness, if you've ever been in Chinatown in New York on Canal Street, you got to really step around the activity, and you got to watch where you're going, of course. There's people behind you. This is an active street. The second thing, the second origin is to spend more time on the fun itself. So what's fun to you about traveling? A lot of times people go on a trip and they do see a lot of cultural activities. You go to the theater, you take some walks, you eat well, you might be getting some sort of education. The question is, what do you remember afterward? It's like reading a book almost. It's like the experience itself is good, but what is it that you remember? And on street runs, we create memorable experiences because we actually don't know where we're going. We have a vague sense, as I'll touch upon. And when I say I don't know where I am, I literally do know where I am right now, but I'm going where I do not know. I do not know how I'm going to get there. I like this guy. This guy's around a lot. So already we're having fun, in my humble opinion. Hopefully yours will. Just checking out this guy's naive work. That piece right there, talk about persistence. It's been there for about 10 years. Well, the School of Fine Arts is around the corner, and the history of fine arts and classic art and the modernist art that we're going to hear about to come doesn't necessarily include street artists or naive artists. Does include some of the furniture possibly. I'm taking you down this street. So just so you know, we're at the Rue de Saint-Père, the 7th. So it's really like on the border of the 7th and the 6th that we are. And I'm taking you Rue de Verneuil. Those who are familiar with the singer, one of the biggest singers from the 60s, Serge Gainsbourg, who married, maybe not married, I don't know. He had a couple wives, but Charlotte Gainsbourg, this is his house. This is always fun when you see like a bunch of street art, and I'm still on the origins, but this is fun, right? You see some street art, you see an Invader, which is super cool. Invader's the biggest street artist in the city. That's Tile Mosaic, you put it up, and that's the relief, that's a image of Serge. And this is Serge's old house, and people pay homage. See, we're not really restricted from being out. Oh, it's a nice day finally, too. I didn't mention that. So somebody lives here, I suspect, although they're doing some work on it. But for French, this is like making pilgrimage to see Serge Gainsbourg. And if you're not familiar with his music, I'll just say anglicize his name, Serge Gainsbourg. And he was a pretty naughty guy who had some pretty naughty lyrics. Well, he was interesting, thought-provoking, let's say. So while I go down this street, I'll tell you the third origin of street running is to have time to react. So the places where we travel, when we can travel again, some of them might be dangerous. So I've been, for example, I'm going to bring up Caracas today. I'm literally in the street moving with purpose because Caracas is dangerous. Caracas, Venezuela is really dangerous. I would never have a camera out when I was there. I was there in 2001. And if you stay in the middle of the street, it literally gives you time to react to what's happening on the right and what's happening on the left. So there's a practical reason for moving in the streets. Now, of course, street running doesn't only anticipate the streets. I'll show you some of this. Gotta do this housing. Fifth origin. To get where I'm going before those following me give up on me. Right now and always on all my walks, I'm hypersensitive to the fact that we all have an attention span, but imagine I was leading people through the streets, trying to take them somewhere. Sometimes you're walking on your own walks and you know that there was a restaurant you wanted to go to, or a museum, or a landmark, and you've got your family behind you or your friends, and you're so sure of it. So moving this way gives some sense that you know what you're doing, even when you don't know. And then lastly, to have more perspective. To have more perspective, it's not always important to know where you're going. Being able to observe and enjoy where you are. I'll show you a map I made. It's really raw, but I sometimes make them if I'm going in dangerous places, which I'm not today. It's really raw, and I would put that in my pocket. If I was going on a street run, I might come across this place, for example, and I might get excited and say, oh, I've never seen this before. And it's 100% true. And I might point. So it's a consumer opportunity. Pastries, really good looking. Little breads. I would imagine these are gluten-free. Okay. So my map is more specific on the other side. I would tuck that into my pocket if I was going in a place that was a little bit dangerous. I don't want you to get the sense that I'm focusing on dangerous walking, but Saint-Germain is the least dangerous neighborhood in the city. But if you truly think you're going to be lost, you might want to carry a little map, even a handmade one. It just makes sense. So we're getting up, in my estimation, near the Sciences Po. This area has really nice schools. Sciences Po is the science politique, so the political science school. I remember right around the corner. So, but if I had never been here before, I would just be following the color, the beauty. I'd be looking all around me. Masks that are built into the doors, and maybe I wouldn't know what this was, and I'd say, "Oh my god," because I actually don't. Look at this thing. This is a door. This is the garage door. You know, you're in an interesting area when the doors are like this. So this is a set of art. You might try to figure this out, but do you really need to know all the details about a thing to enjoy a thing? Is the question. It's an own investigation. This is not temporary. What could we do to figure this out as we go on? We can see a little bit of the markings. You can look the address up. You could find out what business activity takes place in there. I would have a guess. You might not need a guess. Well, let's walk around the side. Beautiful. There's beautiful views. Such area. Okay, so this is rooted back. I know the street. Did I necessarily want to come right to the street? Not so much. But I took a left turn instead of a right and saw some things that I did want to see. Most walks, I have a defined space. So my whole intention of street running is because what I want to get out of travel, most of you probably do, is when I go on a place, it's not one thing. It's usually three things: adventure, culture, and relaxation. And so, question comes to mind. Maybe I flip the screen. Yes. I'm wearing these headphones, even though they don't do anything for me. Is what do we really want to get out of our travel, and how do we get the most out of our travel? And for me, sometimes it's getting the feeling that I really know a city. And that's kind of impossible if you have a short amount of time. Even if you have a long amount of time, I'm extremely active about seeing. I see quite a bit of it. This is actually pretty neat, which you're not looking at me, you're looking at the Atelier Joel Robuchon. It's fantastic. Restaurant, we might stop in. Any of this is open. So Robuchon, I kind of want to go down here. Sometimes you got to pick up the pace. You didn't go where you were supposed to go. So getting a strong sense of the city, to me, has two versions. First version, I know the streets of the city. I know where things are, what's worth it and what's not. Second version, when I don't, I street run, which literally has fast moving. So here, I just ran right into a dead end, but there is no dead ends. One of the principles is you keep moving. You'll find things that are much more thrilling, like that. That's a hotel particulier, that's an individual house. Today it's not, but it was an individual house. Because we're in the area of the nobility, and again, they had massive homes. Rue Gaston Gallimard. Gallimard is the shooting house in Paris. So there are two main ones, and that's one of the biggest. So, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, as I come around the side here, I'm going to introduce some ideas. The street might be a little less thrilling, but I decided to double back just because I'm obsessive. That's just me. So when I'm obsessing, I don't mind seeing the city the way that it looks, because everything is alive to me. I've never seen this place before. Let's see. You hear some music? You might not. But if you were here with me? Oh, right now I hear live music. Somebody's playing live music in their storefront. So I would usually like double back and like listen to that kind of thing. And if you're lucky enough for a door to open, that's somebody's individual house. Just look through there. That's somebody's house. She thinks I'm gonna walk in, but it's not legal. So I'm not gonna do that. So somebody's playing their guitar up in their apartment, just there. Which is really nice because the sun is shining and we're positive and feeling good. And we've just come across the headquarters for Yves Saint Laurent. Something nice too. So let me introduce you to some ideas as we walk near Oscar Wilde's house. We're very near his house. Oscar Wilde said, and this is all informing street running, Oscar Wilde said, things are because we see them. And what we see and how we see it depends on the arts that influence us. To look at a thing is very different from seeing a thing. One does not see anything until one sees its beauty. Then, and then only, does it come into existence. So to look at a thing is very different from seeing a thing. This is from The Decay of Lying. Oscar Wilde, if you came on the Irish Walk, and Oscar Wilde's lifespan is pretty short, 1854 to 1900. And he came to Paris the first time in 1874 with his mom. And then he came back, he loved it so much, 1877, in his early 20s. And Wilde was able to come back a number of times in his life. He had a very interesting life. And one of the things he advocated more than anything else was against realism, which was a movement that essentially was classic and conservative. So the art, he said, lacked at that time the decay of lying, the ability to tell tall tales. He was hopelessly romantic. Now he was raised in a turbulent time in Europe, and this is always what we have to think about when we put things in context. I show you more beautiful homes in this district. The turbulent times in France were, and I'll express them a little bit later on, were the Franco-Prussian War. And the Franco-Prussian War left the Second Empire of France in turmoil. France was neither a kingdom or an empire. They had to redefine their identity. They did so with the 1889 World's Fair. When Oscar Wilde came to Paris in his life, he often tried to meet the people who were doing art at the turn of the century. Degas, Sarah Bernhardt, the greatest actress of her time, Pissarro. He met a guy named Goncourt. Goncourt, Edmond Goncourt, is his family founded the biggest prize in French literature on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. It's always a really nice cafe, but not so much when it's not open. So Edmond Goncourt and his family started this prize. But Goncourt, when he was living, said about Oscar Wilde that he was an individual of doubtful sex who talks like a third-rate actor and tells tall stories. What kind of man was he? He was a dandy. When we're walking around the city street running, there is a basis historically, and it could start with Oscar Wilde, but it probably starts with Walter Benjamin and describing the flâneur. If you've ever heard of a flâneur is a cynical voyeur. It's described by Walter Benjamin as an urban spectator, an amateur detective. Could say that we are all that. It's about strolling. So flâneur is F-L-A-N-E-U-R. And there's a verb in French, to flâner, flâner, F-L-A-N-E-R. So this is the Sciences Po. I had to double back because, well, I just wanted to show it to you. Sometimes when you miss a street, it's okay, of course, but they're so complicated, and I knew that there was something else out there. Sometimes you just feel it when you're walking, like if you're in a city you don't know at all. But let's say that Oscar Wilde was different from the flâneur, because the flâneur was a kind of an observer, right? And a cynical voyeur, meaning removed from the, like disinterested. But Oscar Wilde was completely interested. And he manages to subscribe to being passionate and engaged and ostentatious. That was the Sciences Po I just showed you. So his ostentatious qualities are going to distinguish him. And you know what a dandy is? We've been singing the song when we were kids, I guess. Yankee Doodle Dandy. It's the way that a person's dressed. So the acute observer of industrial contemporary life is what Walter Benjamin spoke about when he described the flâneur. Contemporary life changed quite a bit. When the Second Empire fell, it was already starting to change. And that's because of the Industrial Revolution. I want to just show you the smallest restaurant in the city. It's called the Petite Chaise. I'm going to show you. Some people look for this thing. This is the tiniest restaurant. Hey, they're selling to go here, but this is a pretty well-known place. Why is it called that? Because we're at the Rue de la Chaise. The Rue de la Chaise. I'm going to take, this is a better way for you to see the street sign. Plus, you can see the old street sign, which is always such a pleasure. The old one is above, you know, they chiseled the name into the wall. These guys are really thorough. They even go for a third one. Same thing here, 7th district, you get all the information. And boutiques abound. You don't know what's around the corner, but you feel it because you're in this narrow street, you're in the middle of it. I'm getting excited. I'm telling you about industrial contemporary life. Now, the walks that they took, the flâneur, the dandy, the street running, it doesn't have goals, like I said. Today, when you talk about flâneur, the urban planners talk about it, and they use it to describe passers-by who experience incidental psychological effects from the design of the structure. right? Everything we're walking by has an impact on us. The greatest thing I learned from architecture studies was architecture is the is the enclosure of significant space. So the significant space which is enclosed works upon you when you're inside of it, and if you're outside of it, there is also a feeling. When the street narrows, we have a sense of that. We are animals after all, so we have a sense of our need to maybe be secure, our need possibly to pay attention, but it's also more intimate, and that might be calming. And so the way that the streets work upon us is figured in by urban planners when they design. This is such an old neighborhood, you know, we're talking the 13th century, you have some wild stuff like this. So this is like a recreation. This is like a garage and like one story of a house above the garage, and then this really modern effort just above. This is the most expensive real estate in the city. So whatever it looks like, whether it's got doors, achieving beauty like this, which by the way, when you look at doors, typically there were carvings which instructed you what the family's business was. This shows fruit. I often see fruit, but not everybody was a fruit vendor or whatever proprietor. These are former doors of aristocratic mansions. Look how big that is. That's also the Sciences Po school, but this was somebody's front door. Remember, nobility didn't have to pay taxes, so they could gather wealth for hundreds of years. So speaking about the dandy and the flaneur, that's a little bit of the history of walking. Now, when I talked about the modernization of the city, contemporary culture, so some would write, these aren't always my opinions, but some would write, philosophers, but thinkers and poets and such, that it was the downfall of our society, our demise was met with consumer capitalism. That once there was an introduction of consumer products into our life, the intent of industry was to create moving happiness machines. And the key to progress was creating docile masses. Think about that for a moment as I show you the Lutetia. This is the fully renovated Hotel Lutetia. It is gorgeous, as you can tell. The SS was housed here during the Second World War when they came in 1942. Occupation was 40 to 44, but the card-carrying Nazis came a little bit later. We're at Table, Sèvres Babylon. So Sèvres is the Rue de Sèvres, and the Rue Babylon is where they meet. There's a very famous store, this juncture. This doesn't scream free confinement to me or you, I think. It's like business as usual. The very special building is just ahead of you, and that's the Montmartre. That's fine to know where you're going, as in the morning, if I'm in a city I don't know and I want to go on a street run, I say, I have these goals. And I do have these goals. I have these destinations I want to go to. But I don't know how I'm going to get from A to B. So when I talk about happy, docile masses, this can sound like words. There's a little bit of Edward Bernays in there and thinking of marketing and such. But think about this, the capitalist culture, the consumer culture, I should say. So if we were able to consume today, which, as you can see, the clothing stores were open as of yesterday. They had to close now. And most of these shops are closed. The department store, it's gorgeous. I'm so happy we're gonna be able to see it. It's closed. This is a park just in front of it. So it's Rue Babylon. But the Bon Marché is closed. So if we were able to consume, this city does a very good job because of its history, because of the way it's laid out, at balancing consumption with the pleasure of just living. You come to the Bon Marché, the first department store of its kind. You'd stop in. You don't necessarily need to buy anything. You can also just please yourself by stepping into the cafe in here, watching people. We could be a disinterested voyeur observing life and get a watch if we wanted or whatever else it is. But the fact that the powers that be, the interests of the sellers became to take care of our pains and give us pleasure without changing the objective realities at all. Because if I'm out here in Paris, Paris does a very good job, like you said, at just being beautiful and pleasing. But a lot of cities, New York City is my greatest example, just because I spent 5 years there. New York City, it's almost as if you can't exist without consuming. It's very hard. It is a very beautiful city with lots of cultural interests, but consumption, buying a Snapple once upon a time in the heat of the summer, going for a little bite, it's almost like it's always screaming at you because you're not alive if you're not consuming. It's a little extreme. But it's true that whether I get a Snapple right now, or I get an ice cream, or I get something at the Conran shop, this is the guy who created Habitat. This is the Church of the Immaculate Medal. It's a big story. I'm not sure I can go in there. That's what that is. The entire pilgrimage. I'm going to step to the side. I can't tempt you without showing you a little. And I said metal, but metal. Maybe it should. Pretty serious. Oh, actually, I'm in the second part of the whole thing. This is a mission. The Chapel of the Epiphany is closed today. But I can just show you the front. It's on the side in the Church of the Immaculate Medal. Let's see. So around the time that Wilde is doing his work, and he's a romantic, the French romantic poet Baudelaire was writing as well. We're in the back of the Montmartre, which Émile Zola was famous for having written about. Baudelaire described the experience of living in an industrial society and the shift in Paris, as when we get to Montparnasse, I'll speak more about this, but the shift was from narrow streets, in fact, the creation of grand boulevards. So the notion of like the streets screams to be walked upon by the boulevardier. That Baudelaire said that he was a botanist of the sidewalk. Is that what we're doing right now? We botanists of the sidewalk. I like that. I particularly also like Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs, if you've never heard of her, Jane Jacobs is a Canadian. This is the Immaculate Medal over here. So to Chagall. I think it's up there. It's so random for me to be able to be here. And possibly some of you have been to Paris and you've said to yourselves, I've heard of this place. So long as I'm right here, more street running, I can do it. So Jane Jacobs said that she spoke about the incidental interaction. Ah, pas de video? D'accord. Okay, désolé madame. No video in there. Well, I guess we're gonna have to see it for ourselves. When we come back. No, sorry. That's actually a phrase used to, when you want attention, you say, excuse me. I could have said désolé. Anyway, nobody cares. Thank you back at home. Hope you're having a good time. Nobody, no harm, no foul, as they say. So next time, we'll go in person. I think you find out things along the way, right? It's how we overcome the obstacles. It's interesting. So the amount of people that are here doesn't make sense. Except I can go in here. This is pretty crazy. This is the épicerie. Oh no, I can't. If any of you have ever been here, this is a huge supermarket. But so it's the épicerie, so the supermarket of the Montmartre. It's really classy, seriously overpriced. And it's the subject of this entire line, which we don't want to see. They have like Captain Crunch in there, if you're American, missing the Captain Crunch, and other things from all around the world. It's pretty fascinating. If there wasn't a line, I would have taken you in there. But as it is, we're keeping on moving. So the ballet of sidewalk life is happening all around us. Paris is the kind of city where you don't get to have as many conversations with people, but often when I'm out in places, I think part of the objective for me is always to have a cultural experience where I'm meeting people and they're sharing with me as much as I could possibly share with them. This doesn't happen here as often. I'm going to show you some maps soon of the cities that I've done heavy street running in that I've enjoyed quite a bit. The Paris that Baudelaire grew up in changed quite a bit after the revolution of 1848, as I said. But I told you about the shift in after the Second Empire fell. So when 1848 came around, it was the Restoration. So you've got, just to put you on a little bit of a timeline, the 1789 revolution leads to the Reign of Terror, leads to eventually Napoleon and the First Empire. And then after the First Empire, when that failed, you have a restoration of the monarchy in 1830. And the families of the monarch changed in 1848. The whole thing demised. But in 1830, it was the Bourbons, and it became the House of Orleans. But in 1848, when Napoleon III took over, Baudelaire remarks that the city was reestablished with clear bourgeois pretensions, and orders and morals were at the peak. So World War II, World War I was fighting between nations regarding bourgeoisie values. I'm getting ahead of myself because we're at the turn of the century still. So this is the Rue Cherche-Midi, or around there. It's Rue Saint-Placide. I always like Cherche-Midi. Actually, let's go find Cherche-Midi. I think it's really sweet. Might just be the next one over. At rate, there's a lot of shopping. Things and everything's open. I keep interrupting myself, but just to say that Baudelaire, similar to the notion of like contemporary society, industrial society emerging, and that there was the flaneur that developed. Oh, this is a nice butcher shop. I've interrupted myself. Baudelaire said that traditional art was inadequate for the new dynamic complications of modern life. The socioeconomic changes from industrialization demanded an artist had to immerse themselves into the metropolis. Okay. Can't see too well there, but that's the mère de famille, that's chocolate. So having known a little bit about these streets, I might have taken Cherche-Midi. Might not have. This seems even more quiet. It's fine. We're happy. We're going to run into things. This is the 6th district, and a lot of people took off for the weekend because one of the restrictions I didn't tell you, because I didn't just tell you everything, was that they're not allowing us to go 10 kilometers. This is just from Paris. So this isn't every district, but in Paris, you're being restricted. So people took the opportunity yesterday to go farther than that because they don't think they'll be able to do that again. So they're going to see their families and such. George Simmel, if you've never heard of him, wrote a book called The Metropolis and Mental Life. And he spoke about new social bonds and attitudes towards others, transforming humans and giving new relationships to time and space. That sounds like a bunch of words to me too, possibly. But as soon as industry starts to develop, as soon as the city changes, and we don't have part of the changes themselves Take a breath here. We don't have a part, meaning we didn't have a role in designing the world, the city that we live in necessarily. I sure didn't. As soon as it turns out to be the case that you understand that you're living in a world that was created for it, there is a way to reappropriate it. My way was in San Francisco, I started writing. I would write inside the city. I would sit on the sidewalks and I would try to establish some sound palette, some material that came from not just sound, but all the sounds, not exactly sights, but because I had my eyes closed. But I would lay on the concrete, it was a strange experiment, and try to figure out if I could create a new poetry of the city. So people had done this before me. Some of them were the surrealists that I'm going to describe once we get to Montparnasse. Whether or not the experiments are failures, doesn't matter. It's just trying to do things. They're golden failures. Like that turn I just made could be a golden failure. In any other city, it might be. Right here, I just see a bunch of bicycles in front of me. You know, every street is full of fabulous architecture. Some of you might also think, wow, it's really just the repetition of the same stone, and it's a little bit bland. Of course, there's some scaffolding. It's the comment of some people, not a lot, but it is true that, I don't know about bland, but there is repetition in Paris. What you're gonna see right here is a real failure, which is why I brought up the word failure, of urban planning in its entirety. And that is, this boulevard leads to one of the biggest towers in the city, which is a total disaster of use of space. And that's the Montparnasse Tower. It was deemed a failure as soon as it was being built. So the city didn't go ahead with plans to build another 4 skyscrapers. This street's very easy for me to take. It's just a straight line, which was the intent of the planners. They wanted you they wanted to move their military very clearly through the broad streets so they can control. They also wanted more light and air, which you're getting right here. But as you can see, that's an eyesore. There's not another skyscraper inside the city because once that happened, once the one in front of us went up, the city decided to create a downtown, which is not downtown, which is outside of town. And it's called La Défense. And La Défense is the most dense district in all of Europe during the day when people are at work. But La Défense is nowhere near the Paris that you can walk to. You'd have to take the metro there. And most people who visit don't go there because it's unnecessary. So Simmel wrote that the problems of modern life derive from the claim of the individual to preserve the autonomy and individuality of his existence in the face of overwhelming social forces, of historical heritage, of external culture, of the technique of life. People were struggling to figure out how they could maintain their identity when the collective was as developed as it had become. For Wilde, Oscar Wilde, that meant creating some new aesthetics. So his aesthetic doctrine that he mentions in The Decay of Lying is that art never expresses anything but itself. So when I speak about golden failures, I just front loading this notion, you know, I wrote this thing called Concrete, the notion that if you're really gonna make art, it doesn't say anything at all. Much as the walk we're taking might not have an outcome or a purpose at all, except to enjoy ourselves. If you were here right now, you'd probably agree that we got to get off of this street. But because of just the poor construction of this area, this is one of the worst areas to walk in Paris. Just right here, though, it starts to change. It's just a mess. The building was built just beside the train station, similar to, if you're familiar with the Penn Station debacle, when Penn Station came down and made room for Madison Square Garden. Penn Station was a beautiful train station in New York City. Every city's got some story that's similar about not protecting historical landmarks. So the Montparnasse station went and the big tower came in its place. Another aesthetic of Wilde, and there are three, are that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Take that in for a second. Life imitates art. I know we've all heard this statement, but isn't it more true that even watching, if you're watching television, or God forbid I raise the topic of the Kardashians, but whether it's the Kardashians, Sex and the City, a film that could be good influence, people are starting to act the way that they see, and I'm calling that art, but art is going to influence life more than sometimes life imitates art, even on reality shows. But the decay of lying, this was the reason that Oscar Wilde was advocating for much more tall tales, that fabulousness, ostentatiousness was more interesting. I have not found as many gems as I would like to, but it's true that this is one gem. Today, the Wallace Fountain stands in over 50 places around Paris, bringing drinking water to the people. In the 1800s, during this industrialization of Paris, British industrialist Richard Wallace realized commoners don't have access to drinking water, so he created these fountains. The caryatids you're looking at right here, you'll see the originals in the Louvre. Essentially, it was constructed so that the horses couldn't fit their heads in here. Dogs can't reach the water to lap it up. And if you were selling water, if you were a water porter, you can't put your bucket in here either. If you put your bucket in there to sell water, so that defeats the purpose, there'd be lines for that. So this is for a single cup, and it's a replenishing system. Oui? I'm getting some interaction here. Comment? Oui? Non, je suis américain. Oui, oui, c'est un Wallace Fountain. Oui, je suis avec des gens et j'ai bien décrit. Oui, oui, c'est gentil, merci beaucoup. Merci. Oui, oui, il était anglais. So there are some nice people who want to interact. You probably couldn't hear her as well. This new mic just turns towards me. However, that's the purpose of mixing in this way dynamically. This is so dangerous. I'm not in love with it. This is the worst intersection here because there's no crosswalks. That's dangerous. Okay. A terrible failure of imagination is where I am right here. And this leads me to reinforce Oscar Wilde's last idea. The proper aim of art is lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things. Well, not everybody can be such a romantic, but when he came to the period of his life where by like 1897, he lost his wife and he had less money. He was still writing, but he had children. And then he was still writing, and he discovered before that his interests in life were a little bit different than he let himself take some risks. And he got carried away, and he got sent to jail for sodomy. And he got an abscess while in jail and died as a result of it entering his brain. He got meningitis. But he always maintained that high level of thinking about art and never lost faith in the power. So these kinds of projects probably restore our faith that there was a way in which we did things better once upon a time. And we'll find some more what it is that was done better. And while we do, I'll tell you, my path started out decently, but honestly, this would go on for me if I did like a pure street run. I would be on this for like 10 hours probably. I'm gonna show you some of the cities I enjoy very much doing street running, and you'll see, maybe you've been to some of them, you'll see how dynamic a city can be when you just let yourself engage in it. And then I'll give you some of the ideas that I have about street running. There's a lot to it. There's a big book I've compiled. But to know a city, you have to walk all the streets to make sense of it. But with a little geography and a little history and some facts, street running will help you discover what you need to know to get a deeper sense of the joy and the spirit of a place. So you don't necessarily need to know the urban plans, but just knowing in general about urban plans as we take a look up. I don't get to show this ever. It's not like the part of Paris that people come to see, but thank you for allowing me to indulge you in the Montparnasse Tower. It's got an excellent view. Some would say the best view in Paris, because from the top of the tower, you cannot see the tower. And people love that. That's one of the things people love the most. This is what cafes are doing, I guess, all over the world. Teddy Bear Company is doing real well. So urban plans are designed to reflect the values of culture places on people and on institutions. Train stations, very important. And we're seeing that. If I got behind this, you'd see a little more. But there are things to do here. Lots of people going to Montparnasse is what the train station that takes you to Brittany. So around here, you'll see Brittany is one of the most different areas in France. The Bretonne, since they're so far out west, they're considered to be the most experimental, the most adventurous, I should say, of the French. And they tend to be pretty affable. They tend to be sailors. They tend to learn sailing at a young age. And anyway, when you come around here, they also tend to eat crepes versus baguettes. So there's lots of crepe shops, and that's quite possible what you do before taking the Montparnasse train station to Bretagne. I'd love to cross here. Switch this around. There's some intent on improving the look of the area. You just got to get beyond it, as you'll see. In a minute, I'll take you to behind so that we get to Notre Dame. My map was not Notre Dame. We'll get to Montparnasse. My map was not a good one if I were to have looked at it. But I know that behind these buildings is what I was looking for. I had to keep one district to make this officially a street run. Because if you know where you're going the whole time, that's nothing. With this, I mean, it came along, which is so lovely. And I will improve. You'll stick around for the next half, hopefully. I haven't lost anyone. And we'll get to an area which we would come back to. If you only had 5 days in the city, you might not see this part. So let's show you some pictures. Show you some, and we can ask ourselves, how do places come into being? Well, we show you the pictures. When places come into being, probably as transportation hubs, right? Maybe some other things you're thinking. Let's see if these are going to be all different cities. So these are recognized, of course. So transportation arteries, centers of activity. Cities also are places where showcasing the development of the human mind. They showcase the establishment of governing bodies, the way that they've been oriented to impact the governing bodies and the way the mind develops. This is what I meant to say. So if we get back to the two versions I mentioned earlier of street running, sometimes I know the streets, and when I don't, I street run. Well, I learned them in San Francisco. What you see here is a map. Like I said, if you got to know the city a little bit, you'd have a sense of where you were going. San Francisco is broken down into a lot of neighborhoods, and if you don't know, you're looking at a map which has no topography. So you're really in trouble if you're walking here, because you're walking up and down hills and you might not know where they are. So you would need some time to get to know this city. But as you can see, it's obviously, most of you know, it's a city surrounded by water, the ocean, and the bay. This is Caracas. And if you couldn't, I just increase the size, but if you look at a map of this city, you also don't get a sense of that it's in a valley. But you can follow these streets that are a little more rectilinear instead of curvilinear. Anybody guess what this is? Take some time. You see in the top left an image. Yeah, maybe. It's the old city of Jerusalem. So this map lays things out in this special way, but it leaves out a lot of the definition of the streets. So sometimes, like at this point, I'll tell you some of the principles that I have to make your own work of art out of the city. And that is 3 key ideas. First off, you got to go slow to go fast. Now I've been moving, but if you're in a city like Jerusalem, going slow to go fast is going to help you. You're going to be able to observe quite a bit. And that's a good principle for a lot of things in life. In other words, you go slower and then you move faster. This is, where is this? Exactly. This is Amsterdam. This is Amsterdam. Complicated city to walk around to some extent. You just need to know where you are, like any place. But does it really matter, again, where you are? For us, I'm finally at a place that I want to be in the city, and I had to study this little mini circle. It's kind of hideous place, but when I go to Amsterdam, I just kind of want to get lost because it's everything I don't know. If I walk the wrong way, that's an opportunity to enjoy something I pass by. New Orleans, clearly much more rectilinear, does not give any sense though of what you'd be getting. You see different colored neighborhoods. You probably have to read a little bit about New Orleans to know. If you're coming from the left of that map, you're in the Garden District and Uptown. Then you're coming through, some patches of some rough areas. This has probably changed post Katrina, but you see the French Quarter, and then just behind it, and there's a highway, and the Faubourg Marigny on the right. Well, anyway, New Orleans is fascinating to walk in. And this is Boston. I had to bring it back to the beginning. So Boston is a pre-car city. So it's got the opportunities to walk, which I described at the beginning, at the outset, because that's where I started, Boston and New Orleans. And this is the city of London, a little bit blurry, didn't want it to be, but a little bit blurry. London, if you're looking at a map like this, you're making a mistake because there's so much more to the city of London. But between all these monuments, there might be neighborhoods like the one I'm in right now, somewhat of a disaster of urban planning, or you might get to a really funky, readapted neighborhood. This is Tokyo. In my opinion, everything is fresh. When you're in a city, you have absolutely no idea what's going on. Everything is fresh. And I'm finally in kind of an area where you could say, okay, I think I have a sense of where I'm going. I'm sticking to the street. might have dropped me for a second. As I said, I'm borrowing some equipment. Hopefully it'll pick back up. There we go. And so I'm gonna drop these cities. Okay. So you have to go slow to go fast. Second key idea for movement, this is what we're talking about, for movement. And I've hopefully emulated this while I'm moving in the city. Didn't get frozen, did it? Nope. Sometimes you can make things happen. Sometimes you can make things happen. And sometimes, other times, you have to let them happen. So this neighborhood, nobody could have predicted. It's extremely quiet today. Just relaxed. And I was happy with what I'm getting out of the streets. All of a sudden, you see a more commercial thoroughfare, and you can interact a little differently. We're in the 14th district. That doesn't change anything about the way people interact. This side of the city is a little more conservative. I was going to show you the street name, but maybe you can see 14. It's a little more conservative around here, but that's not going to change a lot about how we walk. If you were in the north side of the city, that's more progressive. The Communist Party headquarters is there. People are more likely to engage. Modest laundromat here. We found a more lived-in quarter. The last key idea is you got to keep going. That's the last key idea for today. Is you got to keep going. You keep going into warmth, upstairs, corridors. You don't stop for doors. You check what's unlocked, overlooked, what can open. I haven't done that as much with you because that can lead to a lot of dead ends on a day like today. But typically, that's just because I have about an hour with you before I want to transition over. And I'm headed to Montparnasse. I'm a little bit off on timing, but please enjoy the path. Timing's not everything. Some would say it's the only thing. I'm going to tell you some more ideas and discuss a little more as I put my glasses on. You might not know, but I cannot see without them. And I haven't worn them yet. So it's a good opportunity for me to put them on. And also to drop my mask a little bit. You can't tell because I haven't turned it to you. So let's see if this street's worth anything. Turn into. I'll tell you, it's worth one thing. It's getting us where we need to go. But you start to see a little bit of dynamic, or different dynamic building. Not saying it's the answer to the uniformity, but this is Montparnasse. We're in a neighborhood which has artists. I'm not getting into the text of that yet because I just want to finish a little bit on some of the ideas we developed. It might be a stretch to tell you about John Dewey right now, because you might be saying, oh, God, what are we doing? But I hope you're not. John Dewey spoke about art and aesthetics, similar to Oscar Wilde. But as I said to you, the street run is like a work of art, as the same as the flaneur. The flaneur used to make a griffe. A griffe is like a cat would make a scratch. So the flaneur used to walk in the city, and they would describe what they did as making a mark, a griffe. And so we've made this little artwork, let's say. And John Dewey said that the product of art is not the work of art. Whoa, what's being said there? Okay, so if I finish a bowl or a short story, Short story is a little more complicated version, but if I finish a work of art, so the product of art is not the work of art. The work takes place when a human being cooperates with the product so that the outcome is an experience enjoyed because of its liberating and ordered properties. So the work of art is only finished in so much as there's an observer around it. Now, that's to say, with fine work of art getting lost in the cities of Paris, if you weren't here to witness this, it might not, it's not that it won't exist, but it won't become what it was meant to become. It works better for art than my walk, but just because what we're speaking about when we do art is ordered properties. So constructing something that's meant to work upon the viewer in a certain way, which is not what I have done. I've merely intended to get you in a place where we can have a conversation about some of these ideas. And I've gotten us quite far from where I intended to get us. Because that's the Montparnasse Tower, which just proves without a doubt that when you want to get lost in a place, you truly can get lost in a place. I'm gonna have to cross the street here. You can take a breather if you want. Normally I would finish on saying that, from street running, saying that it's an art to move through the streets. You do it with your own worldview as a way of creating an experience. And it's different from a walk designed, it's different from a regular walk, excuse me. It's designed to be a number of things. It's not just something that is pure spontaneity. It's not just unedited. There's something to say about tightly edited, but also something to say about spontaneity. And this is more about a process than a result. And if nothing else, just put up on an interesting wall before we get where we're going. This is a little bit of the breather. I just lost my mask. Not a good thing. Got it back. All right. Beautiful. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a vocabulary. Street running. It's a library. The Art Deco. Georges Brassens. Famous musician. A little bit of a vocabulary for dreaming. These are amongst dreaming, experimenting and living. If you're thinking that this sounds complicated, it's not really. It's just that I talk a lot. It'd be nice not to. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do. When we get to Montparnasse. Of course, while we get there, I just want to let you know a little bit about the city during the period of time where Montparnasse became the area where artists lived. So prior to the First World War, after the fall of the Second Empire, artists largely in Paris lived in the Montmartre area. And it's only after the First World War that all of them but there were quite a few who were living in Montparnasse even before. And we're going to describe the period, which is described by some as the banquet years, the Belle Époque. And we'll give you a sense of how where I am right now became full of interest among many of the world's greatest artists, starting with this Rue du Commerce just here. Welcome to, no, I did this before, but this is Montparnasse. This is the commercial street. Let me show you some that guy. Let me show you the name of the street, Rue de Garde. Famous for the invention of the photograph, right? Daguerreotype. So that's your 14th district. And this street will take us to the beginning of Montparnasse, as I intend to show it to you. Butcher's doing brisk business. Let's check in on it. This is the Rue Montmartre for this street, for this district. Sorry. So this guy's open. That is not the first order priority. That is breaking the rules. And this walk will give you a sense of breaking the rules, because that's what happened up in Montparnasse. So as I was saying, in the first part of our walk, Paris is going to change quite a bit after the fall of the Second Empire. A guy named Haussmann, Eugene Haussmann. You might have questions. So, but I didn't see anything in the chat, so I'm just going to keep going. Please feel free to chat. A guy named Eugene Haussmann is going to redesign the city. He's got very ambitious plans to open up what was a constricted city. Like I said, tight streets, narrow passages, not a lot of light, not a lot of air, not north and southbound streets. What resulted during the time period between 1852 and 1871, before the Franco-Prussian War, is tree-lined boulevards, an opera. Beautiful architecture finally showed its face because the streets were wide enough to appreciate it. And Paris got a chance to look at herself. And she realized to herself, she wasn't just a tiny little villages. She wasn't just a city of commerce and exchange. She became a stage, a vast theater for herself in the world at the turn of the century between 1885 and the First World War. And this theatrical quality, this theatrical aspect where the dandy came out and the flaneur, this theatrical aspect defines the Belle Époque, where the avant-garde reared its face in France. People came outside much more. Every movement when you're outside is a public gesture and a private action. There were new circuses, theaters, clowns, horses, acrobats, ballet dancers, cabaret entertainers. The salon declined. The salon, so the living room of some like typically noble people, but very society to invite people into your salon. The salon declined, but because it lacked ladies in particular trained to conduct them. And the great performers, this is really important, the great performers moved from the salon to the cafe. So imagine that period of time up in Montmartre where anyone could enter and each person could pay for their drink. It wasn't exclusive anymore. As we get to the end of Rue de Garde, I'm going to show you some maps to show you how the city is going to change. But first, Montparnasse in all its finery. No kinds of social distanciation, as we call it here, social distancing. Business as usual. again, I urge you to go listen and see about what Jean Castex, the prime minister, told us about what we were going to have to do. He said, this was the third new confinement. He said, you're going to need an attestation to show why you're out. But you're not restricted from hours of being out. You can go stay out as long as you want. And actually, they pushed the curfew up from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. This seems like a reverse of everything that was happening. Because as our numbers rise, I wouldn't be surprised if you're reading in the news that we're going to shift into the next phase of this. Because this can't be sustainable. We got off of Rue de Guerre. So I can continue the thread. The artists that moved to the cafes started to rely on the stimulus and the exchange in the cafes for their work. It became a marketplace of ideas, a free marketplace of ideas. And that's what helped France produce its steady succession of artistic schools. In this area where we are right now, these artistic schools came to life. All the way from Montmartre to the Latin Quarter. And my intent is to show some of these to you today. I'm going to start here at Rochefort. Some of you have been to the city and you've come this way. This is the brand new in an old Art Deco building. This is the brand new Museum of Liberation. This is actually where the Liberation, Jean Moulin is who you're looking at on the right here. And Colonel, or General, I should say, Leclerc here. So the resistance is going to have spent time underground, much as the Nazis were as well. And this is where Colonel Tanguay, so one of the main members of the resistance, and Colonel Roy were going to lead the resistance. This turned into a museum only like last year. This is the more famous museum over here in this equally beautiful. It's not a train station. It's actually the house of the former farmers general, the tax collector. These were two buildings that had a wall between them. That lion there, that's called the Lion of Belfort, named after a guy named d'Enfer Rochefort. This area was called, at one point, hell, basically, which is enfer. And Paris managed to find just the right person, just the right, when the fall of the Second Empire, they needed new heroes. So they found just the right person to keep the pun in order. Because this is still Place d'Enfer Rochefort. That's actually the guy's name, but it was referred to as the place of hell, which would be l'enfer. So we're standing here right in front of the catacombs, which is where this walk starts. It'll get more intimate very soon. The catacombs of Paris are clearly closed. There are miles of catacombs under the city. This is where you would get to see the bones of the dead. I can tell you more about it. They were replaced here. I'm going to just stick to the city. That's the colonel I was describing. Commander of the FFI, the French Forces of the Interior. The street I'm about to take is Samuel Beckett Alley. Beckett moved here at the same period of time that I'm describing. So as I get into the story about the Belle Époque, the transition to all the artists who we will make mention of today in Montparnasse, a neighborhood which gets less, I think, interaction from visitors than at least the deep Montparnasse, than Montmartre, because Montmartre is much more easy to navigate. You'll find that between 1920 and 1930, essentially, but even some closer to the Second World War, you'll find a lot of artists coming from all over the world to benefit from what I'm describing right now. This is the alley, Samuel Beckett, who did work for the resistance as well. And this is named after him because this is where he was helping the resistance gather information. It's a really precious area. That's a train station right there. And you're kind of between, in the last neighborhood, I'm sure there was a nice thoroughfare, but this is one, we're not street running anymore. This place I know. So I'm laughing at myself, but hopefully I had a good time doing that. If we get to go to other cities someday, I'll show you that the more dense the part of the city, like the more surprises. And I know Paris so well that I kind of had to go in an area which was a little less dense. So these cafes are going to nurture the first artistic movement entirely organized outside of salons or outside of people's houses, entirely organized in cafes. And what do you think that movement was? As we walk down this alley. If you're thinking Impressionism, you are right. You are correct. The time period we're speaking about is the late 19th century. And French society, fashions were being dictated by what Alexandre Dumas, fils, so Alexandre Dumas' son, related in one of his plays as the demi-mondienne. So the demi-monde, so that the half world, you could say. It was a special world in this time of Paris of pleasure, fashion, and beauty, and culture, and kept women. You might think of this as kind of a dissolute period, but there was a lot of melodrama at the end of the century. Some of it was comic and some of it was serious. And I'm going to talk about the serious. The serious is the Dreyfus case. And the Dreyfus case is the case of Alfred Dreyfus, who was a captain in the military who was Jewish and who wrongfully accused of trading secrets or giving secrets to the Germans. He was stripped of his rank, and he was dishonorably discharged, sent to prison, and many knew that it was not a true charge. So people like Zola are going to have written to the newspapers and demanded that there be some justice. Justice had miscarried, despite Zola's statement, j'accuse. The society was divided by those who were pro-Dreyfus and those who were anti-Dreyfus. And when justice miscarries, every revered institution reveals its taint. The church, the army, the government, nobility, newspapers, courts. People started losing faith in what this new republic had become, this new modern republic. And they immediately were distracted by the 1900 World's Fair. So the expo was under construction for about 10 years. So the Dreyfus affair lasted, but because of the 1900 World's Fair, people turned their attentions to it, as you do. These days, every event has its shelf life. 1889 saw the World's Fair prior to this 1900 one, and they started building for the 1900 immediately. In 1889, it was celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution of 1789. And there was the first monument to modernism and the Eiffel Tower. And that people despised, but they got used to it after a while. But this is where I'm going with the conversation as we approach one of the finest streets in Montparnasse. There's a lot of people and some nice architecture. When the sun hits, everything looks great. I don't know if you know, but we have not seen a lot of sun. Not lately, definitely not on my walks. So modernism is going to come into the public domain. Impressionism is going to lead the way to post-impressionism. And if you're thinking 1886, if you're thinking 1889, around that period, you might not be thinking, but I'm getting you to think that way. Vincent van Gogh at that time, between 1886 and 1888, lived in Paris with his brother Theo. His brother Theo says, you're going to show your work at the 1889 World's Fair. He goes down south to Arles with Paul Gauguin. And Impressionism is going to have a split off. Gauguin is interested in objectivity, but Van Gogh is interested in subjectivity. And these are two different visions of Impressionism. Seurat, so we're going to see his house very soon. Seurat, S-E-U-R-A-T, is going to found the Société des Artistes Indépendants. So the Society of Independent Artists, where membership was open to all. It was an annual salon, which had no jury. And it exhibited in the space that it provided every new trend in painting. But the artists still strained. They didn't find a following in a prosperous and complacent France. So they bonded together for support. And those are the people that constituted the avant-garde. Let me show you the city that they lived in. I told you I'd show you some maps. So you saw some maps before. You saw that I like maps. That's grand. I do. Here's a lot more about the evolution of the city. I can organize these well. All right. I'm showing you this one because that's the earliest map of like a major civilization up here. That's the Roman civilization. So this was called Lutetia. They built on the island that's near where we started. And then all of this area where we are right now is like part of what you see as a dense area. That's more of the Latin Quarter that you're looking at right there. This is 250 BC, AD, excuse me, 250 AD. The Romans came in 52 BC until about 435 AD. This is a little bit closer image. And I'm showing you all these to show you how the city is going to evolve. That's the island there. And now you're seeing some walls. The first wall around the city, there was a wall around, it was that red interior circle that you'll see. And then it expanded to the one on the left. The one on the left is the right bank. This is a history of all the walls in Paris. When the walls come down, boulevards are going to replace these walls. We're seeing some more images. I told you I'd show you a lot. Back to that first image I showed you earlier. And if you're just coming in, this is the city of 20 districts. We're currently in the south part of this in the 14th. We started in the 6th, right next to the 7th, and now we're in the 14th. And I'm going to take you up finally a street that still wants to go up. It's where a lot of these artists will spend time. Who am I speaking of? Well, in Montmartre. So if you just came in, this is the street we're on again. Rue des Artistes, the 14th. Thanks. Max Jacob, Picasso, Modigliani, those guys lived in Montmartre with Eric Satie and quite a few others. Guys like Henri Rousseau. But up here, there will be Miro and Henry Miller, Chagall, Soutine. Gertrude Stein will live not too close here, but not too far. Just walked out. Rue des Artistes. This is the part of Montparnasse that remains when horrible urban plans come and destroy the city that used to be here. Sometimes on the outskirts, the old studios remain, single family homes, such townhomes, you might call them. So when I said the avant-garde, where I left this off in the narrative, it's a tradition of not homogeneous idea, but heterogeneous ideas, like instead of orthodoxy, heterodoxy, and opposition, which defied civilized values. in the name of individual consciousness. So again, this is a time of modernity and machine world. And there were people who were trying to maintain some sense of being an individual in a larger machine. And they developed a systematic technique of scandal in order to keep their ideas before the public. So guys like Dali regularly held like public, what would you call them now? Public affairs stunts, where he invited he was quite well off, and he stayed like at nice hotels, and he invited all the staff of the Maurice to go out to the Tuileries Gardens and collect flies with chopsticks. And that became a spectacle. Like, that's a work of art, watching hundreds of people in the gardens try to collect flies, and each fly was worth a franc to me. So he was going to pay them. Or he once invited a crowd to watch him with a flock of sheep that was released into the lobby of the hotel. He took out his weapon and he shot them, but they were all blanks, so nobody died. But it was a spectacle. The spectacle gave them the energy of their ideas. That grew out of the, as I would say earlier, the nonconformist tendencies of the Romantic movement. And the climax of this, like just before the First World War, shook the world far beyond Paris. Taking you down this street to get to Sarat. It's a very beautiful street where a lot of the artists. Really, of course, this is close to the peripheral roads, or almost the Pont Rouge neighborhood, more affordable, and there's still many, many artist studios like the one you're looking at. Hopefully the wind guard is there. So the four traits that characterize this area, let's call the cult of childhood, established by the Romantics. So we're talking about the Montparnasse. What unifies the ideology that came up here, artists of their time. And one thing is the cult of childhood established by the Romantics. So it was a reevaluation of maturity. I'm showing you the inside here. It's a refurbishing furniture, but it looks like a studio. So the reevaluation of maturity. They asked, who is the complete man? Of course, it was very male-oriented, their thoughts. And they did a re-examination with a child's candor of the most basic values: beauty, morality, reason, learning, religion, law. So Rimbaud, this is Arthur Rimbaud, another French poet. So I talked about Baudelaire earlier. These guys were all eating opium and that kind of thing too, by the way. So having a lot of the green fairy, if you're familiar with the green fairy, that's absinthe. And Rimbaud, in his mind, these were child men. Artists, as a fact, after Rimbaud, as he described these child men, became willing to accept in art childlike wonder, spontaneity, and destructiveness, not as destructiveness, right? Not as inferior to adulthood. So the history of the modern movement begins with a reaffirmed innocence of all attitudes and all the techniques that have made the arts beautiful, interactive, and adult. This is the Villa Surratt, named after George Surratt, the painter. It's an entire street of houses. One of the most famous ones I'm going to show you is where Henry Miller lived and wrote actually his most famous book, The Tropic of Cancer. So Georges Surratt, lots of other painters who live here. It's a pretty hidden street. If you're quite lucky if you do. extraordinary space. Let's show you this white one. It's a modern architecture from the period of time we're speaking about, turn of the century, 19th century, into the 1920s. So the second defines this era, childishness. And I've always described, how do you get to be a cultural hub? Well, this is kind of what the story I'm building here is. For Montmartre, it was just in the wake of a revolution, the commune uprising, new type of the same area, but it's really the shift in the notion of what is classic and the idea that you can break rules, which is what the avant-garde's always doing. This is still a studio just here. So the second idea is the modern transformation of comic into the absurd. So I just described Dali. It was clear that realism wasn't working for guys like Wilde and poets like Baudelaire, that the dream world, that the romantic world, that the possibilities they were still reaching after were more interesting than what existed. And the modern transformation of comic into the absurd enters. Another nice house. The absence of values in the world or of any given truths. Okay, because that's what they were presenting. It's posed as it's not exactly a negative anymore. It's an affirmative proposition. So the absence of values and given truths is just, the sign changes. It's, instead of being a negative sign, it becomes a positive sign. The absence of values becomes a value. And that's really absurd. But then the absurdity loses touch with the comic. It started out kind of being comic, and when that changes, well, quite a bit changes. I'm going to show you, this is Henry Miller's house. When he lived here for a few years, he wrote, there's no plaque, by the way. That's just how they do this here. Not the entire place, but I think the second floor, it's his place on Villa Surratt. It's got a nice little ending to this street. Somebody has a calm space tucked away, really. Feels very exclusive, but also inviting if you were to come over to this house. Again, the space is working upon us. Backyard. Very nice. I have to head back the same way that I came in, because that's how it works. This is a dead end. So really this kind of losing comic approach, this absurdity. So you can see it in works by, if you've heard of Eugene Ionesco, who has absurd work, Samuel Beckett, you see it with Picasso. All of a sudden the clowns and the horses and the jesters and the circus and the acrobats and the ballerinas. So it moved from Degas' ballerinas to depictions in this pink period of Picasso, which was around, so the blue period for Picasso was 1905, and he is going to live in this quarter as well, but he became quite well off at the point where he moved from his blue period to his pink period. It's the Cubist period where he, Max Jacob, Amedeo Modigliani, Guillaume Apollinaire are pushing the boundaries of what was, like I said, you're supposed to be doing realistic painting, realistic or at least classical if you were going to be noticed in France. But these are the avant-garde that started breaking rules. Let me show you some of the faces, just in case you've just been thinking, who are these people he's talking about? I'm guessing you know some of them. I don't have all of them here, but some of the players. I got almost too many, but I'll show you a painting by Seurat and then some of the others that we'll be seeing along the way. Okay. That's it. Seurat's most famous painting. I think it's the most famous. So this is the streets named after him. This Marc Chagall, who lived on the street. Chagall was born in Belarus. Spent some years in the United States. Never did learn English. That's Henry Miller. Oh, going this way. Excuse me. Henry Miller looks like he's doing a number there, huh? He's like kind of slick. He had more perverse texts probably than most of the authors at the time. He was making money off of what you would call like blue books. That's him on the Pont des Arts looking at the city. Seems contemporary. Oh, he's pretty contemporary. And I encourage you all to read it. His work, Tropic Cancer, is fantastic. It's understandable. Tropic Capricorn, a little more like nonsensical. In my opinion. I'm coming around to another beautiful street in Montparnasse because that's what we're after. You know, a little beauty in our lives here. Doesn't look like much because, as we said earlier about Montparnasse Tower, they removed a lot of the old and replaced it with not necessarily better, but there are little swaths, if you know where they exist, that you can get to without suffering too much modernity. And I'll move right along and tell you a little bit more about, you know, this loss of innocence that I was about to speak about, the absurdity, all the ideas which once were comic then became a little bit darker, called darker, really lost their innocence and festiveness after the First World War. I mean, millions of people died and many more were injured. So that's when Dadaism, surrealism, and existentialism came into being, when people started asking questions of how they were living, what was becoming of humanity. This is a train station, or train tracks rather, made pretty decent by what looks like verdure, but you're not seeing much more than that. Another characteristic that defined this era of Montparnasse is the eruption of the dream into waking experience. People started writing about hallucinations, and dream techniques in art implied an effort to reach beyond the bounds of waking consciousness towards faculties that could grapple with unrestricted intuitions of time and space. What? In other words, again, this notion that you did not need to report on the world that existed, that you could descend into a world which was completely made up, which was a lot of lying, let's call it, in the decay of lying. Nice little train station. Off limits in there. So the dreamscape, and guys, like, if you've heard of the philosopher Henry Bergson, Henri Bergson was writing about dreaming. He also wrote a book called On Laughter. He wrote extensively about dreams. It's fantastic work. Trust me, we're about to get to a really charming street next to the Parc Monceau. Not a lot of people get a chance to come out here because it's pretty, as I would say, deep. Those two are still dressing very nicely for the occasion of walking around in public. Every public act is also a private act. So from this perspective, this doesn't look like much. There's a little street if you take the time to visit. Very rewarding. And we're taking the time to visit. So the last characteristic which defines this area, okay, is the ambiguity. It's ambiguity which shapes the surface and the structure of work. Again, works used to have this clear narrative, direct, clear, linear, and you could be ambiguous. You could use substructure. Some of us read books, and like I started with street running, and I said, what do you remember about a trip? Some of us read books and we're reading for the plot, and that's great, that's entertainment. But sometimes it's just the feeling that's generated from experiencing a character in a new setting, whether it's a book by an English writing author or a Japanese or one of the Latin Americans, just putting you in a mood. Sometimes all we need is that little time and space, and ambiguity helps that. Sometimes you're not looking as much for the meaning of a story because there is not one single one. Rather than the expression of two or more meanings in a single symbol, it was rather than having one meaning, there was multiple meanings in expression. So interpretable work, which sometimes makes it frustrating. Schools often have to teach a certain meaning, but universities can usually open us up to thinking things through on our own and not necessarily settling on one meaning. Here is the street I wanted to take you on. It's a remnant of the deep Montparnasse. People still live here.
Okay.
If you can't hear, the birds are chirping. It's too bad about the cars, but that's the way it goes. It's just like obviously, as you can feel, hopefully a stroll through the city becomes something like a stroll into the country as well, which is what it feels like on the outskirts of the city, because this was country till it was incorporated in the city, much like all cities operate these days. Again, their reason for coming into existence as a transportation route, commerce, and then evolving. It'd be nice to spend more time up here. This is about one calm street in the neighborhood for a Sunday stroll. It's like this. This is art here. It's an installation, permanent. So this ambiguity that I'm speaking about differs from classical. Classical style in writing or in art, it required one expression, one idea, one word to have one clear logical meaning and context. So it was rigorous, simultaneous attention to inclusiveness. So everything had to be presented within the work itself. And ambiguity is more like paralleling a dream work. This is all about the Montparnasse group was attempting to get new material from within themselves. So the notion of a subconscious started coming into being with Freud, like 1915. The thoughts were there, but really developing those thoughts. And these guys were plundering, let's call it, the subconscious, and also resisting the convention of arranging their findings in an established pattern of consistency. So consistency was not what they were after. You're gonna like this little apartment. Oh, the park is open. This park hasn't been open for a long time, so I'm surprised it's open. Trash can, not so much, but yeah. This is the Parc Montsouris, and of course we're going to take a look. I've been here recently about 5 times and it hasn't been open. Who knew when you're reconfined they open parks? I'm pretty sure my timing is a little off because my street run lasts a little long. Oh, we still have some time. This is fantastic. So again, we're on the south, like most south east corner of the city, and this is Parc Montsouris. So Souris is a mouse, S-O-U-R-I-S. This is the mountain of mice. I'm sure there's a different reason for that, but I'll look that up for next time. Montsouris. And the government said you should go out, get exercise. Gets in there. They told us that. That's what people are doing. Nice. It's the first day of spring, isn't it? It's the equinox, so it's nice that they're enjoying it. It's not a massive park. This is all that we can see. So the notion of consistency, some people have trouble with the work that comes out of this period because sometimes it seems to be nonsense. I have problems with like Jeff Koons because this child man who creates like a dog balloon and sells it for millions. I'm not as into his stuff, but that's just a matter of preference. Some of us might really enjoy it. But here what was happening was science had already challenged the principles of causation. Not everything was because God said it was so. Science disproved that. And Romanticism introduced two new factors, preparing ground for revolution. That's uninhibited subjectivity. Again, not objective like Paul Gauguin, but subjectivity. Van Gogh taking his brushstroke and turning it in such a way that he reflected his internal and this, whatever he was feeling, he felt he could put into his art instead of just presenting the world as it existed, his own interpretation of the world. Got moved. We're talking sunset over here. I got to show you a little of that. All right, I'm back on the alley. This is going to get me down. I'm not sure you're going to be able to stick with me as long as 40 kids. Well, most of you knew that this was back to back, so this is great. And I still have to develop these ideas. What's nice is your cameras are off, so if my headphones did not work the way they should, I'm sure I could have figured it out, but I've been working on them quite a bit, and I think there's a malfunction. Anyway, why am I telling you this? Because suppose if you were going to talk to me, you'd also show me your faces, but it's nice just to be here with you. So glad you're here. Sound like Mr. Rogers, because he does say that. Let go of that image if you can. So, uninhibited subjectivity and interest in occult knowledge. Whoa, I'm not going to go there so much, but there was a very big interest in all sorts of different origins of the world and thinking and Eastern thinking. As a matter of fact, Van Gogh was influenced quite heavily by the artist who created, I'm just forgetting his name, the Japanese artist who created the big tidal waves. For some reason, my brain wants to tell you Yasunari Kawabata, who's a great writer that I enjoy quite a bit with subtextual work, but that's not the right person. So convention was being defied. And that's, again, the definition of what the avant-garde was doing. The avant-garde decided that they would extend the artistic creative self until it displaced all guises of habit, social behavior, virtue, and vice. So what are we talking about here? So the creative self, they attempted to take it and say, your art is just an extension of your life. So they wanted to live the way that they were. A lot of artists, you look at them. I went to this writing program, and it's like the most successful so far poets, let's say, out of my program. They don't look like what they write at all. And that's kind of a silly statement, but at this point in Montparnasse, there was a belief that there could be something new under the sun. And you know where that quote comes from, the Bible. Well, they were aspiring that people, mankind aspired to divinity, a belief that they could surpass themselves. And the blend of art and life was an attempt to preserve a spiritual meaning in a universe without a higher power. This is the same time that Nietzsche was responsible for stating, God is dead. It sounds like, taken out of context, it sounds like a bit of hyperbole. But what they were saying is that they were going to operate as if God did not exist, as if they were searching for meaning in a world which maybe didn't have meaning, but they were going to aim for it, something greater than, but they had to find it within themselves. So this was French modernism. And why did this start in France? Why did this start in Montparnasse? And I can tell you that since the first revolution until today, there's turn you around a little. So there's this rare hybrid of stability and constant upheaval. Like today, police in the street like you wouldn't believe. Never seen so much in my life. And yet not one ticket being handed out. Not real fighting. Not a real sense that things were going to go out of control. Because this has been the history of France since the first revolution. In 1789. And the avant-garde took liberties with life itself, the structure of life here, because they were trying to assert a new order. And the history of France is like this violent descent, but it's also like part of the critical spirit. Like dissent isn't, I've said this before, if you've been on walks with me, but it's not frowned upon to be dissenting in your workplace, for example. It isn't a sign of disloyalty. You can have an absolute shouting match. Now, I never tried this with somebody that you're working for, and it will most likely not lead to you being fired or terminated or some question of your loyalties, because it's in the French critical spirit. And why is this? Let's develop this logic a little bit. So active criticism normally bases its undertakings on the possibility of change. But the fallacy of the French critical spirit, as I've investigated, is that the premise of all extreme protest in France seems not to be about change, but permanence. Like anybody who opposes like it used to be the ancient regime, but now it's like the new regime. Anybody who's opposing the rules and such, or stepping out in the street on a day like this and disobeying the new rules for Île-de-France, the region where we are, which contains Paris, which is going out of control with hospitalizations. Anybody who's going to any lengths to obtain a new order of things is pretty sure that actually of one thing only, and that's that nothing will change. So the attempt to change things by the avant-garde in Montparnasse was part utopian and part hypothetical. And it was an activity cultivated for its own self, like in art for art's sake. I enjoyed when I read that, and when I put that together, because it helps me to understand France as I'm living in it. that France tolerates extremes of what I called earlier heterodoxy and outrageous behavior because it knows ultimately that no one will be harmed, that the life of the nation will scarcely be touched. France is avant-garde because it has a tradition of defiance. But the defiance never leads to anything. I've seen it, green vests, yellow vests, excuse me, demonstrations on a weekly basis. But nothing really changes. And in that way, I'm going to make a comparison with the US, but in that way, France, as it said, is inoculated against itself, which I think is an interesting way to look at it. That like those with means who are in power are able to get on, it's not always people with means, but the people in power are able to get on the TV on Thursday night and tell us you're going to be reconfined at midnight on Friday. And they're going to tell you what it means. And they're going to know that they did their job. They did their job and they held the status quo as well, because you're supposed to do your job as a government. You're supposed to protect the people. But even if people go out on the streets the way that I have, this is our third confinement and people are going to lose their minds and it's going to lead to violent demonstrations, possibly, if anything more severe is implemented. So nothing really is going to change. But in the US, if you think about the avant-garde in the US, anything that's actively avant-garde, anything that's new, hip, trendy, that is going to be produced is really rapidly absorbed by the cultural market. So it scarcely has time to find even a name for itself or some sort of movement. If you think about, if you've ever seen anything about Basquiat, for example, I mean, that happened so quickly. It became commercial, like Warhol, those things. Oui? Comment? J'entends pas. Non, 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 non. C'est un live stream. Excusez-moi. Avec qui? Juste pour moi. Juste pour moi. Je suis street runner. Street runner. C'est en anglais. These guys will want to know if I was a YouTuber. The youth. Thing. Here we come up to some Montparnasse, but I'm telling you about the US cultural market because it is conspicuous to some extent that we don't attempt to rejuvenate the art world as much in the US because, well, we try, but it becomes absorbed almost as soon as it's created, if it's anything novel. Whereas here in the past, it has been the case that they've been able to create something new, but typically whatever it was that was new was had an end. Like this movement, it wasn't so much that it was consumed, this particular movement in Montparnasse, as that it was just the Second World War. When the Second World War hit, guys like, I mean, Gertrude Stein, who was here, Pablo Picasso, I haven't even mentioned Hemingway and Fitzgerald, but they came 1922, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, all of these people, Jean-Paul Sartre, stayed here, Simone de Beauvoir, whose house I was planning on passing, but it's far down the street. I don't know what kind of staying power you have at this point, because I should stick to my promise. Timing, it's very kind of you to stay with me this long. I hope you've gotten something out of Montparnasse. There are a couple other areas, of course, that will be nice, and I'll attempt to add those into a conversation on the literary greats that came out. I wanted to show you some of the spots that I took you to here today, as far as I went out, just because it's so rare to come. But I'll keep on walking this route because I think it's like 10 minutes away, and I'm always game for making sure that you see how this all comes together. And when I say game, I mean just to show you, I gotta take you back past. So there's a building in front of me that we saw already, and I gotta take you just like 10 minutes away, and you'll see Simone de Beauvoir's house. I'll show you a picture of her. You can drop it if you need to. It's been a real pleasure to be with you today, and I don't take offense, obviously. I thank you so much for coming out street running and to Montparnasse, but I'm sticking with the thread here. I'm gonna push you back into the streets with me. And if you have the desire to come back next weekend, just let me know. Next weekend, we're doing back-to-back with Tanisha Townsend, Girl Meets Class, and in the kitchen with Justin Kent. I'll be on the streets with Tanisha, and then I'll carry on while Justin is making this recipe of a pitivier, which is a savory tart. Oh, it's gonna be exquisite. We're gonna talk about kitchen stuff. Kitchens aren't functioning right now, nor are bars. So it's nice to be able to get in touch with these people who I've known for quite a while, who are experts, sommelier and chef that's been working his butt off to get where he is, and kind of stuck because his restaurants can't function. So we're doing that next week. I'm turning you around. Maybe you have 10 minutes left in you. I'll get you to the promised land. We're going back through the catacombs here just because that is where I have to go to get some next look at that car. It's very small. I don't know if I get in that thing. I'll get you a little closer to the Lion of Bedford. D'Enfer, by the way, this little spot, if I told you earlier, it was hell, was collapsed because the Romans used to excavate limestone from this area, and they created quarries which were not sustainable. As in, they dug straight down, which is normal, and then they dug horizontally. When you dig horizontally and nobody has the maps for what's underneath, and they build houses on top of that, eventually the neighborhood just collapsed. So this whole intersection became known as the place of hell because of the ground collapsing. There's the Lion. I'm gonna wait for the light, of course. So just down around the corner from here where I'm taking you is Giacometti, the Swiss sculptor, his institute, so the place where he lived and worked, and Simone de Beauvoir's house. Simone de Beauvoir and her love, Jean-Paul Sartre, are buried in the Montparnasse cemetery. So is Samuel Beckett. All of these people define this time period. James Joyce, who I hadn't mentioned too much, defines it as well. These are all modernists. So everybody that we know in the English canon, English and American literature, Irish lad, who was experimenting with language as symbols, with absurdity, ambiguity, comedy in the case of, if you're familiar with Waiting for Godot. This guy's Waiting for Godot. If I didn't show you the name of the street I kept saying, there it is. All right, we're almost there. Well, guess I can't go in that hole. Just ahead of you is the Montparnasse cemetery. A lot of those who lived here remained here their entire lives, like Beckett. Beckett was a young man when he came here. Samuel Beckett was 22. He just graduated from Trinity College in Dublin. and taught at the École Normale Supérieure. It's like in the early 1900s, I think. Yeah, I say 1922. He came back for some time, and then he comes back in 1927, and he remains for like 52 years. He writes Waiting for Godot, his most famous piece, is written in French, actually. He said he wanted to write in French so that he didn't have to pay attention to style. He wrote without style. This is Simone de Beauvoir. You have to run. Thank you. This is good. I got you to the promised land. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for putting in the chat. I am just going to take you by this. Take care. I've enjoyed quite a bit. If you have anything that you want to share, I usually put a little slide that says, right to my TripAdvisor. I'll send you that by email. Thank you so much to you and Jan. I appreciate you being here as well. To Hannah, who left. This is practically where I want us to take you, just so you see. There you go. Simone de Beauvoir, her house, the life we live in Paris. There's plenty more to it. I hope I see you soon. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Thanks for having 2 hours with me on a Saturday. Thanks for chatting. And oh, Annie, you're the best. I'm talking to myself, but I know you're there. So that's the beauty of this. And let's do it again soon. All right. Au revoir. Take care. See you soon. You think I'm gonna hang up, but really, I'm just pushing to get you to the next spot. No, I'm gonna hang up. I really am. This is just the Institute Giacometti. I had to show it to you. I'm walking you here. So it's just a beautiful building. Bye. I'll switch the camera and then I'll let it shine as our last spot. Au revoir. Be well. Thank you so much.